And who says there's not an interest in public transit in Lorain County, right? Okay. Want to welcome all of you to our Transit Summit. We thought it was important to start bringing individuals in our community who are interested in transit all together at one time under one roof to begin the discussion for 2015. I want to recognize my colleague Ted Kalo, who's here tonight. Lori Kokoski was hoping to make it as well too. Want to welcome all of you to this summit. What I'd like to do at this point is I see a lot of elected officials in the room, and we'll try to go as quickly as we can, but if we could just go table by table, elected officials, if you would just please stand and introduce yourselves.
Terry Booth, State Representative.
Others? Which order we want to go in here? There you go. Nick?
Nick Turner, Office of Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur.
Okay. Mayors?
Lorain Mayor Chase Riddell.
Okay. Other elected officials? Okay. I want to thank Terry Booth. It's important for everybody in the room to know that we have a good connection now in Columbus because Terry Booth is chairing the Transportation Committee in the House, and Gail Manning is chairing Transportation in the Senate. So we couldn't ask for a better connection than that. But we want to thank you for braving the weather and for being here, and we've got two great speakers for you. What we will do is in between the speakers we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and some conversation around that topic, and then we'll move on to the next speaker and we'll have about 10 minutes of questions and conversation around that. So with that, we'll turn it over to Barb Barna with the League of Women Voters.
On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I'd like to welcome you all here. It's a wonderful turnout. I'm glad you all fought your way through the snow because these speakers are going to be terrific. And now I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who will be Tim Rosenberger. Tim is a transit operations planner based at Parsons Brinckerhoff in Cleveland, Ohio. He began his career in public transit with the Greater Cleveland RTA in 1992. In 1994, he joined the Baltimore office of Parsons Brinckerhoff, which is an international transportation planning and design firm based in New York. In 1997, he relocated with Parsons Brinckerhoff to London, England, where he supported transportation projects in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He returned to Cleveland in 1999 and currently leads Parsons Brinckerhoff's Cleveland-based transit operations and system planning group. This group has completed transit corridor and system plans in many U.S. and Canadian cities, including Cleveland, Ohio, Miami, Florida, and Oakville, Ontario, among others. More recently, Tim was the consultant manager of the West Shore Corridor Alternative Study, which analyzed the potential for commuter rail service between Sandusky, Lorain, and downtown Cleveland. He has also led a team which developed RTA's strategic master plan in 2011 and led Parsons Brinckerhoff in supporting development of NOACA's regional strategic plan, which was recently approved by that agency's governing board. A native of Niles, Ohio, and a proud graduate of Youngstown and Cleveland State Universities, he lives in Lakewood, Ohio, with his wife and 3 children. Please give a warm welcome to Ken Rosenberger.
Thanks very much for that wonderful introduction that I wrote. So thanks for inviting me tonight. And you know, I've had some experience with Lorain County and with Lorain County Transit, with transit agencies around the country. And I'm going to talk to you tonight a little bit about sort of the impressions of the Lorain County transit system as it exists now and some of the issues with that, and go over some items about why there's going to be more transit in your future than there is today. And Ken's presentation is going to pick up on a number of those themes. And I've sort of gone through and taken out some things that Ken is going to cover later, but we can talk about that as we go. I also want to talk about the difference between rail transit and commuter rail and local transit, and why I think it's important to keep the two separate, and that we really need to be keeping ourselves from getting distracted by the potential for rail transit and focus, at least in the short term, on serving the real basic transit needs that exist here in Lorain County. And then talk a little bit about, based on my experience and what I've seen in some other places, where we might want to go from here to start developing the kind of transit system that Lorain County really needs and deserves. So why Lorain County needs more transit? Well, Lorain County is the 9th largest county in the state. It has about 300,000 population. It has a large Hispanic population, and we're going to talk about, relatively to this state, 8.4% of the population is Hispanic, about 25,000 people. And as we're going to talk about a little later, minorities, African Americans and Hispanics have somewhat higher propensity to use public transit than other groups. And although we don't have a large African American population here, we have some. In Lorain County, we do have a relatively large Hispanic population. However, we have the 20th largest transit agency in the state of Ohio in terms of the funding. And the funding was, I believe, $1.6 million, something like that. That sound? Oh, 2.5, I'm sorry. I took this from the National Transit Database. So, 25th largest in terms of number of buses that you have in the fleet. Again, that could be wrong, too. I don't know, but it's small. And the 21st largest transit agency in terms of number of riders, with about 70,000. Does that sound right, or is that also? Yeah. So, you're talking about something that's sort of out of the scale of the size of the population, and particularly the fact that you've got a fairly urban county with Elyria, Lorain, Oberlin, Amherst, and a number of other places that the suburban area along the border with Cuyahoga County. That really, the scale of this transit system to the size of the county and the need that's out there is just not there. That you have a situation where places that are much, much larger, much smaller places have much larger transit agencies. And that's due to the funding level that you have here. This is Lorain County Transit System. I took this right off the website, so you see the places where it goes. It's isolated to a relatively small area around Lorain and Elyria, and again, that's based on the availability of funding to provide that. We just looked at, we've done about now, over the last 10 years or so, we've done about 15 studies analyzing the redevelopment of transit systems around the country, places all the way from Jacksonville, Florida size, Orlando, or Fort Lauderdale, Florida, all the way down to very small cities, much smaller than this, actually. And we have a few things that we look at with that, and I'm going to go through a few of those things as we talk over the next few minutes here. One of these things that we look for is the location of hospitals. You got a lot of hospitals around here, and I really wonder how people get to them, that are really dependent on public transit, to say nothing of who cleans them. Because you really have, hospitals have a large base of people who are in food service, in janitorial services and things like that, who are relatively low-income folks. And, there's no possibility of them to use public transit to get to most of those locations. Dialysis clinics. Now, you do have a couple of dialysis clinics on your system. Dialysis clinics are an important destination for folks who are dependent on public transit. There's quite a lot of them that need that service, disabled people, and so forth. You have a number of dialysis clinics that are outside the area, but you do have a couple in the area. Finally, Walmart. Now, a lot of people, you do have kind of service to one Walmart down there south of Elyria. But, we have in our office, with working with transit systems of a relatively small place, a rule called the rule of Walmart, which is that routes always end at Walmart. Because that's where people want to go. And a lot of people are condescending and really don't care much for Walmart, but low-income people really need to get to Walmart, and if you're trying to live on $800 a month, the difference between a $2.49 box of eggs and a $1.49 box of eggs makes a big difference in your life. So you try to get to those Walmarts. You do have service to one Walmart. I'm sure that's jam-packed. But you got a number of Walmarts out there that could use the service. This is just really showing the paratransit area. And the vast majority of people in this county and of locations in this county do not have access to the paratransit system within that area. So, this is, again, indicative of a lot of need. We also looked at a number of demographic maps. We superimposed your map the transit map on here over some of these places. And again, I don't want this to come across like we're criticizing Pam, we're criticizing First Transit, because I think they do a great job with the funds that they have available to work with them. But you can see there's a lot of need, even in the areas within Lorain and Elyria. There are places with relatively high population density, places with a lot of zero-car households, people who don't have a car available to them. This is one-car households. In many cases, this is people who are sharing. There's 2, 3, 4 drivers, maybe 2, 3, 4 people working, going to school, and they're sharing one automobile. Rental housing, often a big indicator of transit use. Again, you get a lot of areas with concentrations of rental housing that are outside the transit service area. Households living in poverty, again. Minority population, again, places that are located outside the area. And it's just because the service, the funding that you have available does not run to providing service to all the areas that need it. And that's just within Elyria and Lorain. You really have a lot of areas outside. You have, I'm sure, growing need for people within Elyria and Lorain to get to locations outside of Lorain and Elyria, particularly a lot of those areas along the Cuyahoga County border where there's an increasing number of retail jobs, where there's a large hospital that just went in. And for those folks to find jobs, they really need to have access to those locations. So just to sum this up, transit is underserved and underfunded relative to many other counties in Ohio. Lorain County has significant high transit propensity populations. There are many key destinations that are not being served simply because the funding is not there to get there. In addition, Lorain County is actually losing potential transit funding due to its lack of matching funds. There's about $400,000 sitting down at NOACA every year that gets reallocated to other transit agencies because Lorain County doesn't have the match to bring that in. It's not a tremendous amount of money, but in the context of $2.5 million, it's a lot of money. It could make a difference. So anyway, that is the deal with transit service in Lorain County. And, I'm going to move on now into why we think that there's going to be more transit service and why we are seeing everywhere in the country a growth in transit demand. I think there's probably more items here, and Ken has a few more things that he talks about. But we're going to go through these one by one here. First of all, gas prices. Now, recently we've had some relief on gas prices. We're down around $2, was down quite a bit below $2. But that's not the long-term trend. The long-term trend is that it's going up. And I think, the last I heard, they aren't making any more of it, down under the ground. Eventually it is going to start to get tight and run out. And so the price, I think, because of demand going up in other countries, because of it's getting harder to get it out of the ground from the places that they have to get it, that number is likely to continue to increase over time in the long run. The population is aging, and I've got on here showing the population in the United States as well as just in the NOACA 5-county region. This is a piece we put together for the NOACA strategic plan that we just finished up. And what you're seeing here is that these age cohorts between what was in 1990, people between 15 and 35, basically my age group, being the largest cohort of people, and that group is just moving through the population and that group is just getting older and getting older. And if you project that forward another 20 or 30 years, you're going to have a large number of people who are in the elderly category. And many of those people over time are going to lose their ability to drive a car. They're going to lose their ability to drive a car at night first, and then be unable to drive at all. Many of these people are aging in place in Lorain County, and that the place where they're aging is not served by public transportation and is not served by the paratransit system. So the demand for paratransit we're seeing is increasing. The age trend in Lorain County is getting older. Lorain County is older than Ohio on average as a whole. It's significantly older than the USA, at about 41 years average age right now. And as this group ages, you're going to see increasing demand for paratransit service, and we're already seeing that in a lot of places. I'm sure you're seeing it here. People calling more. In the RTA land in Cleveland, paratransit demand went up from about 375 to almost 675,000 trips a year, just in that 10-year period. That's almost a doubling. So in a normal situation, you're going to be seeing that number rising at 7 or 8% a year, probably for the next 10 to 15 years, and a sort of doubling over a 10-year period. Another issue here is, I wonder what happened with the heading on that thing. Anyway, you're also seeing economic polarization occurring in the country. It's happening slowly. It has sort of happened for a long time, but it's particularly picked up in the last 15 years or so, where you're basically seeing, the very rich people, households over $150,000 a year, is staying about the same at about 10% of the population. But you're seeing these lower income bands growing, with the people under $15,000 a year growing over that time period. From all the way up to $75,000 a year. You're starting to see these bands growing larger. What that is basically squeezing down the middle class. And what you're seeing as that happens is more people who are going into situations where they need to use public transportation for economic reasons. Basically, when you get into a situation where you're earning probably under about $15 an hour, if you're operating a car, you're being subsidized by somebody. You're probably not capable over the long run of owning and operating a vehicle if you're earning that little. Because, a repair or the car dies or whatever happens would make it impossible for you to replace or fix that car without some sort of input of funds from some other source. You have a lot of jobs here in Northeast Ohio that pay less than $15 an hour. So that's over the long haul, unless this is reversed somehow, this economic polarization, you are going to be seeing the need for public transit go up, and you are seeing that in a lot of places. Another piece here is the minority population growing. We know that around the country, across the country, that the proportion of the population and the number of people in minority groups are growing, and minorities do use public transit at a higher rate than whites do. That includes Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans. And I think this really has to do, and that's regardless of income level. And I think it really comes from the fact that they're just more accustomed to it. They've grown up in families that have more of a tendency to use it, grew up more in urban areas, and tended to live in urban areas. So the growth in the minority population over time is also going to contribute to that growth. So all of these socioeconomic and demographic trends virtually guarantee ongoing growth in future transit demand in the United States, and Lorain County will not be an exception to that. Governments at all levels, even in places that have much better situations and funding, are not really prepared for this increase in demand. And eventually, this is going to become a bigger political issue in a lot of places, and you're going to see that political logjam that's preventing new funding at the federal, state, and local levels to come in. It's also interesting that what's really happening, and the folks from First Transit probably have some experience with this, but it used to be that what a lot of people complained about was, well, bus drivers, people who work in transit make a lot of money, it's too expensive, on a unit cost basis. Well, that's not applicable anymore. We can't find people to do this job for what we're paying now. We can't find people who are qualified to do it. In order to drive a bus, particularly a paratransit bus, you have to pass 2 tests that are very difficult for some people. One of these involves going into the bathroom with a bottle. And the other one is that you can't be a felon. So, you know, for a lot of the people, when you're talking about a job that pays $15 to $20 an hour and involves driving a bus, you can't find people in that price range that meet those qualifications. So, you know, it's going to be much more difficult to sort of put the growth of this on the backs of the workers that do it, you know, and you're going to have to come up with the funding for it. Now, this is the one that's going to lose me some friends here, potentially, so I want to talk a little bit about this, including the friend that I drove here with. Right, I have to drive back. I have to drive back to Lakewood with him, and I could be, you could find me in the trunk of my car at the bottom of Lake Erie tomorrow morning. But I don't, right, exactly, right. That's a very good point, Ken. Got to keep that in mind. You know, I worked on, back when I was in England, they were actually working on the first phase of the Neorail study, and then I worked on the second phase coming back from that, and, you know, we identified a number of corridors, including this one, which was considered one of the more promising ones, going out into Lorain on the nickel plate going through Lakewood. And, you know, that spawned, in Neorail Phase 2, we really narrowed it down to these two corridors, the corridor going out here to Lorain on the nickel plate, and then the other one going out to Manaway on the east side. But then that led into the commuter rail study that we did, the West Shore study that we did several years ago. And in that project, we really laid out a plan for just in the commuter area of service, not really getting into the broader issue of Lorain County Transit. We put together a plan that basically started us from where we are now, which was with no service, basically operating into Cleveland from within Lorain County, to where we might be able to build a market to be running commuter rail service in the West Shore corridor. And I still think that there's some possibility of that. I you know, think that it's going to be difficult, and I think as each year goes by, it gets more difficult for reasons that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I think that, you know, where it has to start, if it's going to start, is with two things. Number one, getting a real commitment to running commuter service in that corridor on buses into downtown Cleveland. And the other piece of it, I think, really has to be redevelopment, or, you know, a commitment to making the development higher density around where the stations would be located in some of these places between Lorain and the border with Cuyahoga County. And I know that a bus was run for a few months, maybe a year. I don't know how long it was, a year or two. Yeah, a year or two ago. It was not successful service. I think that you know, there may be some tweaks that could make that potentially a little more successful, but I think that it is going to be difficult for a number of reasons to get that really going. The other piece, you know, I think the places, and I think NOACA particularly going forward is going to start getting much more serious about this issue of transit-oriented development in areas that are well served by public transit. NOACA is going to be doing a transit-oriented development case study project later this year that's going to take a look at the possibility of transit-oriented development in some of these areas. But certainly, you know, using your zoning, using your county and your local land use plans to promote a higher density node of development in these areas, like around downtown Lorain, but also in some of these other areas out along the commuter rail line, is going to be crucial to any future commuter rail service, if that's to happen. I think, though, you know, that it gets more difficult over time for that to happen, just because your destination, downtown Cleveland, is becoming a less important destination as a work trip destination. Commuter rail service really depends on having people who are commuting to a place, and it's got to pretty much be a single, very large place. This very confusing diagram that I've put in front of you was put together by one of my colleagues at Parsons Brinckerhoff many years ago. And it shows the number of people in terms of dwelling units per acre, the residential density on the lower x-axis. I guess it would be the lower axis of the graphic. And it's showing that in order to have any kind of transit service, you really have to have about 4 dwelling units, about 10 persons per acre to support that. And then you have various levels of transit service. When you get up to about 7 or 8 persons per acre, then you can go to more frequent service. And once you have about 12, much more frequent local bus service. And, then these warrants also look at the levels that you need to get to for light rail service and for heavy rail service, like RTA's blue, green, and red lines, or BRT service, like the Health Line in Cleveland. And what this is showing is that for commuter rail, generally speaking, to really work, you have to have on this y-axis an employment center size of a certain size. And the size that you're looking for there is 50 million square feet of office space. Downtown Cleveland has about 15 million square feet of Class A and B office space, and maybe another 5 or 6 million of lousy Class C office space like we just moved out of in the Rockefeller building. And that is a bit low for commuter rail, and it's actually a bit low even for bus rapid transit service. I think when you add in the Class C space, you probably get to about the level of light rail or bus rapid transit service. Now the claims, like in Cranes and a number of the organizations down in Cleveland, are saying there's 125,000 people working in downtown Cleveland. If you go outside at 9 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning on a spring day, it doesn't look like 125,000 people, in downtown Cleveland anymore. I work in downtown Cleveland, and it's just, it's growing in residential population. I mean, there's some chance it's going to be well over 20,000 people living down there. But it's become really more of a regional entertainment district than a regional business district. And unless you get into a city size somewhere around the size of Philadelphia or Chicago, it's really hard to support a commuter rail network. Now, there have been places that have 1 or 2 commuter rail lines, and smaller places. Nashville, Tennessee has one. A number of other cities have 1 or 2 lines going in, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. But it is going to be very difficult, and it is going to require many years of disciplined growth and cultivation of the service in order to make that happen. So I think that's something that needs to be thought about in some ways separately. Now, there is this Northern Ohio Rail Alliance, which Ken and I were talking about in the car coming out here. And this is a program that NOACA has engaged in, is working with TMACOG in Toledo and some of the other organizations along the line to analyze possible intercity rail service between Cleveland, Detroit, and Toledo. I got them in the wrong order again, see, just like you said. With a possible stop in Elyria. And I think that that is really a different market from commuter rail. It's an intercity market. It's sort of a, trips that are a little too short to take in an airplane, but a little too long to take in the car. And I think that may be the place where we might want to focus our efforts in developing rail for this region. There's supposed to be, any day now between the end of 2016, there's supposed to be a study being done of that service and what that might look like, and the rail connections that are going to need to be made. Basically, there's an earmark stuck in ODOT limbo waiting to come out to do some work on that. And I think that may be the better piece. It is going to require significant state and local investment. We know that the state of Ohio has not been favorable to rail, in recent years, passenger rail, but that could change as well. There is going to be some local investment involved. I think the work that you're doing with the Elyria Rail Station, the work that's already been done and the work that you're continuing to do there, helps to facilitate that and helps to facilitate the potential for Elyria being included in that service. So I think that for those of you who are interested in rail, I think that that's probably the place to work on it, and I think that that you then to start making the case for the longer or for the more local commuter rail service. But when we get into why we shouldn't be distracted with rail, I think that the items that I talked about earlier, the issues, the transportation issues, are not going to be served by rail. You have paratransit trips for the elderly and disabled that really are needed, medical trips, intra-county work trips, people traveling within the county as well as to locations just outside, school and college trips. Those are going to be tough to serve. And when I started out in the public transit business, this business was largely, especially when you got into doing these regional studies and regional commuter service studies and rail studies, you're really looking at how can we entice more people to use public transit. So you were trying to basically get people out of their cars to use public transit. We're starting to run into a different issue in a lot of places, and that's that we have all the riders we want. They're in city, they're in the inner city and in the inner suburbs. Or there are people in the inner city who need to get out to jobs in the suburbs. And we have all the people we can handle. We don't need any more passengers. What we need is more money to provide service in order to serve all the passengers who want to use the service. So that becomes a different problem. And one of the tools that we were trying to use to entice people to use public transit was rail. And if you put in light rail, people would use it. In a lot of places, they called it white rail, because the white people would use that. They didn't feel bad about using the buses, and, that was one of those unfortunate things. But it was a situation where you were really trying to entice people out of their cars. That's over. You don't really need to worry about that because, under the funding constraints that we have in most places, you can't serve all the people who want to use the service now. The cost of commuter rail also, you saw some of those numbers back there, $159 million, to build the first phase of commuter rail, $221 million. That's real money, and a lot of that would not come from the federal government under any circumstances. So that may be out of scale with your capacity to raise funds within this region and within this county. To pay for that. So that's something that I think you'd really need to take a very hard look at if you were going to try to make those kinds of improvements. I think that those kinds of improvements are going to have to come on the back of some kind of national or regional effort like this NORA effort, that has an application that goes beyond the Lorain area and probably has applications that go into freight rail as well. The other thing I would say when you're talking about public transit is that rail has many fans, but it also has many enemies. And, there are a number of people who just think that the cost is out of, just too expensive for what you get. A lot of Tea Party people, a lot of people who are more on the right politically. So I think that that's something that, that doesn't necessarily to apply too much to local public transit unless you make it that. So I think by associating local public transit and things like paratransit for the disabled and really basic levels of service for folks with rail, you can have a tendency to end up being tarred with the same brush as being something that's overly expensive and a sort of waste of taxpayer funds. Again, I think supporting NORA is probably the best way to promote rail, I should have said rail transit, in Lorain County at this time, and I'm sure that Ken will be keeping you up to date on that. I noticed your presentation doesn't talk much about rail, so I was amazed. I'm talking more about rail than Ken is, which is really a switch. So where do we go from here? I think that there's some really basic things that need to be done here. I think you need to create an organization, if there isn't one already, called Friends of Lorain Transit, and you need to start raising money because it's a political process and it's an expensive one. There needs to be a county needs assessment. I do those, but and I know that's sort of self-serving. We have done those in some places, but others do them as well. But you really need, I think, to do a couple things. I think you need to get some numbers and quantify the need for transit that is out there. You need to sort of gauge community interest among the movers and shakers in the community as well as among the general public. Get a sense of what the folks who are using public transit right now are doing and what they'd like to, where they'd like to see the transit service go. And, identify your supporters and start honing your political messages that are going to work in this community to get public transit. I know there's been a number of ballot initiatives go on. I wasn't a part of any of that. I have no idea, what actually happened with any of it, but I think that there are political messages out there that have sold this in places that are far more conservative than Lorain County. and, you've got to get your funding together to hire a political consultant. I don't know how much money that's going to be. We just did a renewal. We were part of a group working on a study leading up to the renewal of Lake Trans tax, which Lake Tran is probably the most similar place in this region to here, and, has a similar profile in a lot of ways. And I think they spent $80,000 to $100,000 on their campaign, on the political consultant and then the campaign. That was to renew the tax, which they had already had for 30 years. So you may need to spend more in order to get to that number. So anyway, I know people who do this for a living, and be happy to put you in touch with them. But I think that's the key, that's going to be the key to this. I think the themes that you need to really focus on are, first of all, door-to-door paratransit for the elderly and disabled. It is very hard to say no to that. If you are able to get enough funding in, you should be able to offer door-to-door paratransit throughout the county. And I think that's usually the political message that has the most resonance with people. I think the second point that people really focus on are access to jobs and educational opportunities, especially for young people and for new workers. I think it's important, to focus, to acknowledge, sort of, that transit's not for everybody in a place like this. If you could carry 6% of the trips in this county on public transportation, you would win an award. So, but there is a market for it. And I think, one of my colleagues, John Gobus at PB, coined this saying, I don't remember what agency it was for, someplace out west, but it's the people you depend on LCT. People who go to, the people who keep the hospital going, the people who work at the restaurants, the people who work at the mall, who work at Walmart, and who work at everything that you need that sort of underpins your life, hotels, things like that. They are very likely to need this service, and it's, in fact, can be very difficult to find people to do those things. And often, some of your best supporters of doing things like this are people who employ a lot of relatively low-income workers, hospitals, but also fast food chains, calling centers, and places like that have a need for many low-income workers and just have a very difficult time getting them to the sites. So I think that's part of your work, in addition to working with charitable organizations, with social service organizations and so forth, as you build your coalition. You have a lot of people in this room tonight, so I think you have a good start, for putting this together. I think the people here who represent some of these organizations and agencies, you really need to get together and should be able to make some real progress here. But I think, again, you really have to start, I think, by creating an organization that's really dedicated to this and that can raise funds in order to do the things that need to be done in order to move this forward. Now, I wanted to take a look real quick at funding sources. And, in this part of the state of Ohio, sales taxes are the usual way of approaching this. All the transit agencies around you of any significant size have a sales tax in place. Greater Cleveland RTA, 1%. Akron Metro, 0.5%. They just went to 0.5 from 0.25 back in 2008. They had the good fortune of being on the same ballot with Hillary Clinton versus Obama, the fight of the century. So regardless of whether they liked Hillary or they liked Obama, they liked Akron Metro, and they voted for the tax over 60%. So Lake Tran, SARTA in Canton, PARTA in Portage County that Ken is going to talk about, and WRTA down in Youngstown, 0.25%. Now, what I figured, just looking at the internet, $25.7 million was raised by Lorain County's tax, existing piggyback tax at the county level in 2013. If you were to get a third of that, that would be $8.5 million. When you add to that what you would get from the state and the federal government and some other places, you'd have over $10 million to work with, which is over 4 times what you have now to work with, and would probably allow you to do some expansion. Probably you would want to focus on countywide paratransit for the elderly, limited local fixed route service, maybe extending some of the things that you've got out there now to reach some important destinations, and then possible limited commuter bus service to downtown Cleveland or to Hopkins Airport. So there's, when you take a look at the network that Lake Tran has put together for around $10-12 million a year, I think, you can see sort of what the possibilities are when you have that kind of funding available to work with. So just summing up, I think, Lorain County is obviously underserved by transit today. The demand for transit is only going to increase in the future. And a strategy focusing on the elderly, on disabled people, students, and new workers should be able to fill that critical need with a 0.25% initial sales tax. So that may be getting a little more into the details than I needed to, but I think I've had an opportunity to think a lot about Lorain County's transit needs over many years, and I think it's an important thing to be resolved by this county.
Okay, our next speaker is Ken Prendergast. Ken Prendergast is Executive Director of the nonprofit organization All Aboard Ohio, so he's a railroad buff. All Aboard Ohio promotes improved railroad and public transportation services in the state. Ken has been active in All Aboard Ohio and its predecessor organization since he was 17. He served All Aboard Ohio in a number of capacities, including Director of Research and Communications, Vice President, Newsletter Editor, Director of the Cleveland-Pittsburgh Special Project, and Akron-Kent Regional Coordinator. Ken has also worked as a consultant for the Neotrans and Restore projects, whose clients included the Western Reserve Port Authority, Ohio High-Speed Rail Authority, Ohio Department of Transportation, Cleveland Waterfront Coalition, and others. Ken was a staff writer and correspondent for 20 years at Cleveland-based Sun newspapers, and still does freelance writing for various transportation industry publications, as well as sports media, like the Bleacher Report. He has also co-authored a guidebook called Car Free in Cleveland. Ken graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in public administration from David N. Myers College in Cleveland. Previously, at Kent State University, he majored in transportation logistics management and minored in urban geography. Please welcome Ken Prendergast.
Thank you very much. And I guess what all of that means is that I can't hold a job. Let me see if I can find my presentation on here. Second here. Ta-da. Okay, very good. Okay, so just as a point of clarification is that our interest is in moving people, not necessarily moving vehicles. When we get into the whole rail and bus issue, our emphasis is trying to get people to where they need to go. And there are advocacy efforts out there and advocacy groups for cars and planes and buses and trains, and we're mostly the trains, but also the buses as well. They are kindred spirits in our opinion. So when we talk about all of these issues about public transportation in Lorain County, why do we need public transportation? And why is this a issue of relevancy for Lorain County? Public transportation is an issue that can make Lorain County more relevant. And one of the biggest changes that's occurring in the last really 5 years, but in particular over maybe a 10-year period that we've seen this trend, is due to two particular groups. And I'd like to introduce to you two friends of mine, which is the baby boomer and the millennial. And why these two groups so important is because they are forcing change in not only in our transportation system, but also in our land use policies and, as we call it, having more low mileage lifestyles. These are two very important groups because when combined, they represent half of this country's population. And so we cannot just isolate them as being, okay, well, that's just them. Well, that's a lot of us. So the baby boomers are, born 46 to 65. Fortunately, I just missed that. They started retiring a couple of years ago. And why that's important is because they're driving less. They're downsizing. They're moving into smaller quarters. They don't need the big house anymore with the extra bedrooms for the kids that aren't there anymore. They may not need that extra car anymore. They may go from 2 cars down to 1. They're physically discouraged from driving, is that the older you get, the less able you are to drive longer distances. Your stamina goes down. Your eyesight goes down, as Tim was talking about. Driving at night becomes more difficult. So your driving needs have changed, your travel needs have changed. Millennials are born in the years from 1980 to 2000. I heard a great description of who is a millennial. Well, millennial is somebody who doesn't remember the Cold War. I think that's a great description. They're financially struggling. A lot of them may not have full-time jobs yet. A lot of them are volunteering to get that work experience. They're very involved in their communities. I'm often very impressed with millennials about how much they care about what's going on. They are also very misunderstood. And one of the things that I found very interesting, and we often have a lot of interns come and work for us, and they always talk about, I want to live somewhere where I can have a certain lifestyle. And we talk about Portland, Oregon has done a very good job of identifying that lifestyle that millennials want. Portland is often called the place where millennials go to retire. Okay? And think about that in terms of what young people want is they want a community with amenities. And they don't necessarily need a big house or apartment. The city is their apartment. That's their living room. They spend very little time at home. They spend it more at the coffee shop or at the park. That's part of their social networks, as, of course, our digital networks. And they go and look for those communities first, and then they go and find the job that they want. Very different from how people my age and older did it. They went and found the community first that had the job that they wanted, and then they went and, okay, well, what is there to do here? Exact opposite with millennials. Their transportation needs are very different. Whereas my age group, and particularly the older group, is car first, okay, that's their default thinking. These folks think about choices and different ways of getting around, and bikes and transit. These folks will spend, drop $1,000 on a bicycle and think about, oh, I don't know if I want to put $1,000 down on a car. That's a change in thinking. If they need a car, there's car sharing services they can go to. If they do buy a car, they may buy a used car. And of course, they're interested in using public transportation. Millennials, they're driving 23% fewer miles than the previous generation, which would be mine. 92% of, this is a great stat that because 1983, this came out of the University of Michigan study. 1983 was the year I got my driver's license, and in that year, 92% of people who were ages 20 to 24 had a driver's license. Well, those in 2010, only 80% of them had a driver's license. This is not necessarily a financial issue. It's a cultural issue. In 2011, this is an average among all age groups, that for every 20 people, one new car was purchased. But when you get into the younger age groups, for example, ages 25 to 34, you had 35 people, they were buying one car for that 35 people. Or for those 18 to 24, 222. You have to ask 222 people to find somebody who bought a new car. It's very different. Another interesting thing is that cities are growing faster in population than their suburbs for the first time since the 1920s. Even Cleveland, which as a city as a whole is losing population, but its urban core is gaining in population, and in fact is gaining in population faster than all but I think 2 or 3 of the very outer suburbs. And by the year 2020, I believe, when they're predicted to get around 20,000 people, there will be only 10 suburbs in Cuyahoga County that will have more population than downtown Cleveland. There was a study done by Interest.com that identified, well, how many metro areas had a median income that allowed them to afford a car, and they found only one of these cities, and that was Washington, D.C. They can afford the average car price, which, by the way, the average car price now is just shy of $30,000 for a new car. Ironically, that's also how much it costs to build one parking space in a structured parking deck. It's a nice little average stat there. So the number of households without cars is increasing. In Ohio, in 2000, it was 8.6% of the population, or 8.6% of households didn't have a car. Now it's 9%, so it's going up. The ACS refers to American Community Survey, which does those number crunching for the census. So this is shown up in a couple of graphics here that I'll show you. This one shows the amount of driving, we call it miles driven. And this is the amount of miles driven on all roads in the United States. And as you can see, since 1970, it's gone up and up and up and up and up until November of 2007, when it started tailing off and plateauing. And so it's actually down 2.3% from its peak in 2007 in terms of the miles driven as a raw data. This is not adjusted for population at all. If you adjust it for population, you get this. So if you took those miles driven as an aggregate and divided it by the population in changing over time, we have gone back to January of 1995 in terms of the miles driven per person. I think it's gone down to like 39 miles per day or something like that per person. The peak was in June 2005. So what has that meant in terms of funding for transportation? Meant less federal dollars because less driving means less fuel taxes, and of course we have more fuel-efficient vehicles today. Transit ridership has gone up its highest level since 1956, which ironically is the year that we passed the Federal Aid Highway Act to build our interstate highway system. We have a lot of aging roads and bridges. That interstate system and other federal aid highways are reaching the end of their built life. Yet we are still building more miles despite the amount of driving that's decreasing. We added 310,000 lane miles between 2002 and 2012. That's according to the Federal Highway Administration. And because we are having, we're adding more miles to the system but yet getting fewer gas tax dollars back, Congress has had to bail out the Highway Trust Fund multiple times for the tune to a total of $50 billion since 2008. In Ohio, unfortunately, unlike a lot of other populous states, ODOT does not invest in public transportation to a significant degree. For every dollar that we spend on highways, we spend 1 cent. I'm sorry, yeah, for every dollar we spend on highways, we spend 1 cent on public transportation. As I mentioned before, 9% of households in Ohio have no car, so there's a disconnect there between the spending versus the need. If we spent, right now we spend $7.3 million per year on public transportation in Ohio. If we increase that ninefold, do the math, we're over $60 million per year. And that leverages additional federal dollars too, as Tim noted. We're 40th in per capita transit spending. I believe we're 46 in actual dollar spending. These 4 states, West Virginia, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Wyoming, all spend more per capita on public transportation than Ohio does. When you get to the 10 most populous states, except Ohio, which Ohio is ranked number 7th, all of them are spending $50 or more per capita on public transportation. By comparison, Ohio spends 60 cents per capita. Yep, it's that bad. However, we have some great news, and notice there's an asterisk next to that, because the great news is, okay, it's great news for Ohio. And the great news for Ohio is that the budget that was announced on Monday, and Director Ray was before the House Finance Committee earlier today talking about his ODOT budget, had increased the budget for public transportation by $1 million a year. So we are up to 70 cents per person. There was a recent study done by ODOT itself that looked at what the needs are for public transportation in Ohio, and that study showed that the funding for public transportation needed to double. So from 7.3 million to 15 million. The money that we spend on public transportation results in jobs. It's not money that we're just throwing at a vehicle or a service. It comes back to us in terms of real jobs. And the Surface Transportation Policy Project, which is a national transit and walking and biking alternative transportation advocacy group in Washington, D.C., their estimate was that when we invest in public transportation, we're getting 19% more of a payback than we would invest in roads. That doesn't mean we should stop investing in roads. That just means we need to be spending more on public transportation. We spend a lot on roads as it is, and we're spending more on roads because of the issues that I mentioned before, and we're not getting as much back in terms of the gas taxes. So the subsidy is actually growing for roads. It's gone up to 72% of road user costs coming from non-users. That's up, or that was 72%. Now it's gone down to 50%. So rather than raise the gas tax, which is a difficult political lift for a lot of elected officials to do, they've borrowed the money in the hopes that the additional investment in the highway system will generate more vehicle miles traveled. As you say, build it and they will come. Well, unfortunately, they're not coming. And that additional 310,000 miles of new lane miles that we've added has not brought new driving. There was a tremendous statistic that came out of the Federal Highway Administration a few years ago that said that for every lane mile that we build in a city on a freeway, it costs $15 million to build that lane mile. But yet we're getting $60,000 per year in gas taxes back from that lane mile. Thus, it takes 250 years to pay back that cost of that lane mile. And by that time, you've had to replace that lane mile at least 5 times. So you're never gonna get back to that, never gonna recoup that. We talked about Lorain County being an urban county, particularly in the central and northern parts, that it's the second most populous county in Ohio without a dedicated funding stream. When we mean dedicated, we mean a sales tax or some kind of voted-in revenue stream that's coming in. So Clearmount County down in southwest Ohio, north of Cincinnati or near Cincinnati is number 1. The only public transportation that we've got in Lorain County that links us to the outside world is the Oberlin Airport Shuttle. And it runs several buses per weekday, and it grows like at the start of the end of breaks around Christmas time or Thanksgiving or at the end of spring break. So that's your link to the outside world. There's also Greyhound service that goes into the Lorain County Transportation Center in downtown Elyria, which is another way of getting in and out. The airport shuttle goes, of course, to the airport, and there you can connect to the Red Line rail service to downtown Cleveland. 13% of households in Lorain County don't have a car. That may be a surprise to a lot of folks. And as Tim mentioned, there's a lot more people that share that may have one car in that household, but have multiple wage earners in that household. But census doesn't break that down and cross-reference, well, how many wage earners per automobile. That data is not out there. If we look at the region and where are the no-car households in Northeast Ohio, the darker the shade, the more no-car households there are. So, of course, in the urban areas, you see a lot of darker shades. But interestingly, you see also some darker shades in some very rural areas. And anybody know what that is? It's the Amish. Okay. And just as in Amish areas, they will have buggy lanes on the side of the highway. In cities, we have bus lanes and bike lanes. So they accommodate for those different needs. When we look at the region as a whole, Brookings did an interesting study and found that that 70% of available jobs require a 90-minute or more transit trip. So the other way to turn it around is that only 30% of jobs can you reach in 90 minutes or less. Only 30%. So as we talk about trying to lift people out of poverty and get them into jobs, and they talk about the best social program that's out there is a job, and transit can get you that job. But Either the transit doesn't go out far enough or the jobs aren't where the transit is. There's a disconnect there. Fitch Ratings did a very interesting analysis last year. Of course, Fitch Ratings looks at municipal governments and county governments and state governments and says, all right, what are your bonds? Are your bonds a good investment? And they'll rate them. So they looked at what are some of the external factors that are coming into play that might affect the value of those bonds and how communities are adjusting to this major dynamic that I mentioned about with the millennials and the baby boomers. And with the increases in multifamily housing and the declines in driving and the greater need for public transportation, that cities need to change and that counties need to change. So we've seen the greatest shift towards multifamily development because baby boomers are downsizing, millennials are moving out of the basement and getting jobs and usually locating in cities. We mentioned about public transportation use going to its highest level since the 50s. These are direct quotes that Fitch said, is that the next 50 years is going to be very different from the last 50 years when it comes to public transportation. And if we keep doing transportation the same way that we have, those areas that are still following the old status quo are going to lose to those that are changing and adjusting to the new paradigm. Policymakers need to adjust to that. And if they don't, they are at risk, is what Fitch said. These are the folks, like I say, that rate your bonds. So when we look at major cities like Cleveland, what are they doing to adjust to that? And we've seen, Tim mentioned about downtown Cleveland population growing rapidly. And a lot of this stuff is happening around public transportation routes. Everything that you see here is on a public transportation route. Like here, the Little Italy Station development there. Well, that's the Little Italy Station that's under construction right now on the left. We have the Health Line that's going by the Uptown development, which has just got a highly rated score from an organization that rates transit-oriented developments. The Flats East Bank project, which is along the light rail waterfront line. The development here at the end of the Blue Line in Shaker Heights. And then our office used to be right next to this development, and every building that you see in this picture is under renovation or just finished going under renovation. So the tall building in the center, that's the 9, that's where Johnny Manziel lives. That's also a hotel there. It's a very nice, very well done building. In the front here is where the new Heinen's is going in. It will open later this month. It's a full service grocery store in the Cleveland Trust Rotunda. And on the right is the Schofield building, which will be a Kimpton hotel and apartments. So major changes happening. But it's not just happening in the big cities. It's also happening in some of the smaller towns and tied around colleges. And one of those that we can look at is Portage County, which is smaller than Lorain County in population. I went to Kent State, and so when you see the 68,000 trips in 1996, that was pretty much what it was when I was there 10 years earlier. So it hadn't changed much in 10 years. But then a few years after that, they passed a local sales tax. They were able to expand their services beyond just serving the college students and expand into more services and more markets. So now they've got routes out to Stowe and Ravenna, downtown Akron, downtown Cleveland, out to Hiram, Streetsboro, which has the Walmart, Garrettsville, which may have a Walmart, but it's got it's a historic town and it's surrounded by rural areas. So they've served the whole county. And again, that goes back to that 0.25% sales tax. And if you look at that in terms of economic development, well, this is downtown Kent, and downtown Kent looks very different today than when I went to school there. Small towns can attract young people, and of course colleges are a big reason why, but can you hang on to them after they graduate? And so if you've got an attractive built environment and that offers transportation choices built around public transportation as well, you can have a very attractive community that can hold on to your young people. This is how much Kent has changed in just a few years. Upper left is in 2008. This is the corner of DePeister and the Route 59 bypass that, as you can see, is not a very pedestrian-friendly area in 2008, but in 2013, just 5 years later, it's very different. This is over $100 million worth of development that grew up around this thing on the left, which is a $27 million transit center, and we balk about the cost of the transportation center in downtown Elyria. This thing is much bigger than that, much bigger investment, and it's resulted in a big spin-off in downtown Kent. And you can see some of the spin-off development there. They got two major employers that used to be in downtown Kent to come back. They were out in the, quote, suburbs of Kent. I don't know if a small town like Kent can have suburbs, but they were out in the outer fringe of Kent, and that was Davy Tree and Amatec. And they both moved back into downtown Kent. And so there's a lot of spin-off retail that goes with that, and restaurants, and not just the college students, including this very European-style looking close, as we call it, or alley here. So that's an example of some of the kinds of benefits that can result from having a better public transportation system, whether it's rail or bus or whatever the case may be. As long as you're able to get people where they need to go, that's the key factor.